I've been at the University of Texas at Austin for 16 years. I'm in the Department of Chemical Engineering, also in our Center for Nanomolecular Science Technology, and we also have something called Texas Materials Institute. And so my field is nanomaterials chemistry. I've been to Europe a little bit. I was on sabbatical for, well, about 6 years ago in Spain at University of Alicante for about 8 months, and then in Grenoble at CNRS for a couple of months. And I'm spending the month in Barcelona teaching a class on nanotechnology innovation. So I'm glad I made it, because my plane I thought was not going to make it, and then all of a sudden they said, we're boarding, and it was only 2 hours late, so perfect timing.
Okay, so I'm Paul Thurk. I am with Arch Venture Partners, and Arch is a US-based early-stage venture capital firm of 28 years, and we have about 1.7 billion under management. We're a little different. We focus on the hard sciences, and so that's going to be physical and life sciences. I guess we've actually worked in both. Physical sciences side is going to be a lot of advanced materials, semiconductors, nanomaterials, etc. Life sciences is going to be a lot of therapeutics, genetics, things like this. And a couple of years ago, well, I should say, our mainstay actually is to do new companies directly out of universities and national labs. And a couple of years ago, we actually started to expand globally. We started out in Shanghai. Oh, look at that.
Perfect timing.
I hope it's worth it. And, you know, these slides aren't actually that good. Yeah, this, you know, so this is, I covered that. This is actually a useful slide, because we tend to get involved at the very early stage like this. Most VCs get involved here more so, more and more every day. And most European VCs actually get involved after that. So we have a little bit of a different niche, because a lot of times, as I'll describe, I'll go over a couple of the projects that Brian and I have done together. There's just, you know, some in a lab coat and one of us basically starting a company, which is exactly how we did those two companies. Here's a sampling of the different universities we've worked with across the US, and now in our expansion into Europe. These are institutions that we've spent time with, and we've done several companies based on European technologies at this point. Here's what we look for. So we look for core technology, so real fundamental research is really our bread and butter. Like, to be honest, it has to be a little wacky even, you know, because what's really important is to get broad intellectual property coverage around that particular area, and the way you get that is if you have a new material that someone hadn't thought about before that has new properties that you can build products around. And on the latter piece of that, it's really important to have multiple different product areas, because when we start companies, and I'll explain the ones we've done, you always pick one. You pick your best bet, and it always, well, about 50% of the time we're wrong, and we end up doing something else. So it's really important to have the optionality. So a couple of slides on idea to company, just to set the framework. You have a discovery, you got to decide how big a discovery it is, and then you got to decide if you want to do a company or a license. And this is really going to boil down to if it's something that's really core and, you know, important and tending to a large or burgeoning market opportunity, or if it's something that's more incremental, like a small change, like making something 10%, you know, polyurethane 10% better that Dow Chemical will want to license. You know, that's going to be more of a licensing exercise. Now, if you do the company, you know, you've got to go through, you know, sort of define all this stuff, the opportunity to market, get a team, a clear plan. I mean, we don't start out like this is what we help build, but that's all very important. And then you go and you raise money from, you can get a bunch of different groups. There is examples of big, large, important companies being built with all of these, particularly credit cards and even the Vegas lottery, which is how Federal Express got started. Or how it survived. So I wouldn't recommend that, by the way. That's not one of the takeaways from this presentation. But you know, usually, you know, so we span the whole distance. But usually, in any company, you start and you spend a lot of money with the hope that you're going to make money in the out years, and you know, usually raise money from a bunch of different sources. You know, one last thing on that piece I said about intellectual property, it's so important to have broad intellectual property, because that's going to define the size of this curve. And that's where you get the value and the return. So that's just to set the frame. This is a case study in one of the companies Brian and I did together. This one all started with as most of ours do, we saw a publication in the Journal of American Chemical Society on Brian's work in quantum confined silicon nanoparticles. So I called up Brian, and that started the whole thing. One takeaway I do want you to have from this is, big idea research and visibility is really important. So getting published in key journals is really important. That's how you get noticed. That's how people call us. You get the important collaborations, etc. That is a underlying thing in all the companies we've ever done. And then actually having the cash to properly patent it and do the last proverbial experiment, which I think is more, at the institution level, actually having those resources available is critical. So, Brian and I got started on, he had a supercritical process that he was making these nanoparticles, and we actually started out by getting a couple of government grants. I had a $10,000 loan from Arch Venture Partners, and we got a couple of government grants. Turns out we had real trouble, I won't go into huge detail, we had real trouble getting the particles we needed. We were trying to make a new light bulb, basically, like light-emitting plastics with an inorganic emissive layer, kind of like an organic light-emitting diode, but with nanoparticles in the middle.
Trying to replace the light bulb.
Yeah, we were trying to replace these, actually. It was a really cool idea. We had a real struggle with the original reactant, so we switched to one out of the University of Buffalo, which is a laser pyrolysis approach. Brian's a supercritical approach. And we actually got some interesting results and really started to work out the chemistry that you put on the particles to actually keep them from agglomerating and realize the luminescent effects. However, we had low yield, and so we ended up switching to a technology out of the University of Minnesota that was a plasma-based reactor. And so another takeaway from this is that often the path to commercialization, you start on one thing and it ends up being a very circuitous path that you could have never seen when you started out. So we rummaged through that, and it turns out, we still had issues, and it turns out it's more than fundamental technology. I think this is another important thing for IST because you do a lot of very fundamental research and thought discovery, and it turns out, this was no different. I mean, this was cutting edge stuff and understanding how, the atomic structure of these small silicon nanoparticles, and we had no way of knowing what road was going to be ahead. When we got there, we found out we weren't going to be able to make a light bulb out of this stuff. But the inks were actually very usable for other things, and that's where that onion I showed you with the different applications becomes really important, because there was multiple other things on that onion, and we went through them all and decided to do solar, which ended up being the market application. We got qualified into the 4 largest solar cell manufacturers, and DuPont eventually bought it. Not only did we, along the road, have, trials and tribulations with process and application, we also had other things pop up. We got a lab at the University of Minnesota where it was an old crime lab. So we got into it, and we were in there maybe a week, and we found this kilo of cocaine. So this is 2 of our researchers.
In a corner.
And so we're going to make a joke out of it and take a picture with these guys like they're behind bars. Shut the door. We didn't actually have the key to this vault. And so they got locked in the vault. And so we had to call the guy who ran the lab previously to come and let these guys out. He came straight over. Turns out he took it home as a party favorite, got busted, and went to jail 2 weeks later. So, there's a lot of, ups and downs. We got tons of stories like that. One of our companies got apprehended by the Guatemalan army, and had to pay a ransom to get them out. I can tell that story later. But so sometimes you don't see these challenges coming. But in any case, DuPont ended up coming and buying a Novalight, and it was a nice end in a very bumpy path, not dissimilar from the rest of ours. It turns out that we actually had an encore to all this, and that is when we were working in the supercritical reactor initially, it made very good wires. And they kind of came out looking like this right here, where they're like a Brillo pad. And this kind of got kicked out of a Novalight because it can't quantum confine a 1D structure. Well, I guess if you had domains or whatever, but we really couldn't. So we kicked this out, and then we did the same exercise where we looked at what could we do with those. Looked at all these different possibilities. Actually built, used them to actually do demonstration products in several different areas. Ended up kind of focusing on this, making transistors, and we involved Merck, German Merck, in this part of it. And they ended up coming and actually acquiring it eventually. And the entire time, another common theme here is this very fundamental research. We didn't really know where it was headed. We didn't know what the limitations would be. We didn't know what the capabilities would be. We only had a theory, but it's different once you get the experimental data. But we always kept a high line on the intellectual property, involved the biggest brains we could in academia and industry to help us figure out and solve big problems and bring them into the fold as opposed to keep them out, and ended up having a nice end to that one as well. And so that's all I had as far as the introductory piece of how Brian and I met and how we did two companies that got acquired by two multinationals. So we thought that might set the frame for questions, discussion on the topic of commercialization and some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So how does the process go? Do you guys? So at some point you decide you want to make the new light bulb. You realize that you won't be able to make it. Do you just sit around the table and say, what could we do other? Or do somebody come up and say, hey, we could do that on the? Or do you actually meet up and discuss this?
Actually we had all that starting out. You'll have a population of things that you believe you could do with it. It's kind of before we get involved, we try to get comfortable that there's multiple other application areas. And so it is a little bit like that. You start to see the writing on the wall and start having problems, and so you do sit around the table and go through all the different application areas to choose another.
Yeah, so from a practical perspective, so the like at that stage in Innovolite, the board would meet once a month, and so not all the board members are. It's a small company, so it's a board of 6 people. How many?
6, yeah.
6 people, mostly representatives. So Paul, who was the acting CEO, myself, I was on the board at the time. And then mostly representatives from the venture funds that were invested in it. Not all of them, but some of them. And so, stuff happens really quickly in these companies. You're always thinking, what's the application? What we wanted to do was general illumination, light bulb, clearly billion-dollar market. But, you have your technology challenges, but then you have competing technologies. So there were white OLEDs at the time and also high brightness LEDs. So around that time, both of those technologies were doing really well. People were putting a lot of money into them. So not only were we struggling with our technology, but if you look at the competitors, we were just we knew we weren't going to make it at some point. And so this idea of pivoting your technology or figuring out what you want to do next is a challenge. And it is literally, I think one of our meetings was at a restaurant, with the board or something.
That's kind of the key one, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was this really intense meeting over dinner. And intense in everyone's eating and you're there. And you're discussing the fate of this company. And at that time, there were a lot of things we were talking about. So we were talking about trying to go shop, trying to sell it at that point. And Paul and I had a conversation once where I was looking at what we had, and I was like, I think we could get $20 million for this.
But we had Dow Corning, right? Yeah,
we had someone who we thought would probably buy it for $20 million. And at that time, if you did the math, for me, that would have been a really good outcome. For the investors, they weren't interested at all. So there's that's an interesting thing. So when you're doing these decisions, you're thinking about what technology can you hit. So do you have options? What's your platform? What do you control? If you sold that, what potential are you giving up to take it? So it's always bird in the hand versus 2 in the bush sort of thing. Applications we had talked about, one was phosphors. So because we were doing lighting, we knew a lot about what you needed for high brightness LEDs, which you have this blue LED and you've got to have a phosphor that down converts that into white light. So we had a material that could do that really well. We actually made white lights from high brightness LEDs and silicon nanocrystals as phosphors, and they worked really well. But if you looked at the competition and the market that was available for that, and how if you became a phosphor company, you end up beholden to the lighting companies a certain way. I mean, so there were factors like phosphors was one of the first things we thought about as like the next thing we might do. And it was, we decided against it. The market was too small. Even if you had the technology, it wouldn't be as big of a win as, you know, we sort of wanted. And it was really hard deciding what to do. Super hard. And when the company decided to do photovoltaics, we were half like, okay, I think this makes sense, and half like, this is the dumbest idea ever. I mean,
tell them what the original, it wasn't, you know, tell them what the original photovoltaics idea was.
Multi-exciton generation. So there was like people batting around the idea like, we'll make solar cells where we utilize multi-exciton generation and quantum dots, which at that time, multiple exciton generation and quantum dots was a really controversial topic. Like now people have shown you have MEG in a wide variety of nanocrystal materials, but then not only do you need multiple exciton generation and quantum dots, you have to extract them. So anyway, yeah, that was our next best idea, I guess, which is ridiculous.
So we didn't hit that one either, actually.
Your investment committee, no?
I'm sorry?
That would be a tough thing in your investment committee, I guess.
But
The quantum dot.
oh no, that's what we went with. Yeah, no, we went with it. But we did not end up going to market with that. We ended up just using PNN doped inks for the selective emitter solar cells. So we didn't even hit the multi-exciton thing we tried.
So how did you start in the beginning? I mean, how did you meet? Did you read his papers? Or,
Yeah.
Or
he published in Jax. I read the paper and I called him.
So you saw a press release, right? First?
Maybe.
I think one of your colleagues, because you were working on lighting, like you were a Kaufman fellow, and then you were kind of digging into lighting, and someone sent you a press release, and
one of my
then you
partners
saw the paper.
So got the Jax paper, called Brian directly.
so sending out press releases is a good way of getting in contact.
I don't think you guys did it just gets picked up in the wires. Like if you do like really interesting research, the wires will pick it up, like nanotech.web or whatever. Like these guys pick it up and they'll give the excerpt, and then you can go get the paper, and that's actually pretty fertile grounds for us. Like, you know, we get
it's true. It actually wasn't a press. My university wasn't promoting it. It just somebody in the media saw the paper. I think like CNE News or something just did the paper, and then the next thing you know, people were talking to us.
Yeah. So here's a question for you, Brian. Before Paul called you, were you thinking at all about commercializing this, or how were you thinking about that?
Okay, so no, I wasn't really thinking about commercializing it, but at that time, it was a time where a lot of people were getting interested in nanotechnology. So 99, 2000. Around 2001. So there was a point where I was getting calls from investors like once a week. And it turned out a couple of those people that I had talked to before Paul turned out to be real problems getting a Novolite started. A guy named Zviyanev who was, it's a long story. I mean, it's complicated. People come talk to you, and I honestly didn't feel comfortable with any of the people that I talked to. I didn't really trust them. I didn't know. If I started a company, I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to protect myself. I didn't have a lawyer, all that sort of thing. And so when Paul came and I talked to Paul, and we had several discussions. There was some discussion about a company that Arch had formed or was involved in called Nanosys that Charlie Lieber and Paul Avasatos. And so there was some discussion about maybe bringing my technology into Nanosys, and then just decided it'd be better to start a company around it. But we had several conversations. I'd gotten to know Paul and also Paul's colleague Clint Bybee, and essentially I trusted them. And I guess they trusted me, probably. But for me, it was like, I don't know who these guys are. I'm just going to trust them.
Did you develop the patent before publication, or took advantage of the grace period in the United States?
grace period?
Well,
Big advantage.
at the time we met, you didn't have a patent. Remember, we did the actual chronology was we came up with the last proverbial experiment. This gets to the cache thing. One thing University of Texas did do right is they allowed you to take some of that capital to do a demonstration device to show electroluminescence. And then once we showed that, a patent was filed. It is a provisional patent.
Yeah.
So there.
It was within the year after the JAX paper.
Oh, I see.
So,
Right.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah.
Right. We don't need
Yeah.
either. Yeah.
So
We got rid of that.
Yeah. So the JAX paper came out, and then essentially Novolite came in, decided to start. We filed a patent before the year was up. And I wouldn't have filed that patent, I don't think, unless there was someone like Arch there willing to do it and pay for it. And it wasn't a cheap filing.
Yeah, we didn't even pay for it. We never paid for that.
Oh, you didn't? Okay. I know I didn't pay for it, but...
Sorry.
You described that you had to change the production process, the technology or so multiple times. So who actually did that work? Was it you personally, your students? Did the company hire somebody? But then if the technology changes, do you find new experts every time? Or, I mean, in this starting phase when there's no real product yet?
The company, so the company hires people, employees for the company, and then they're initially working on developing the supercritical synthesis. You realize, wow, the yields are way too low, this is never going to work. And then at the time, it was really David Yerbergs, who was like our...
I think it was more, I mean, it was really, we kept a broad scientific advisory board.
Yeah, we had an advisory board. I was talking to a lot of people. I mean, so things would come across my desk, like papers and things like that. And so really, like Mark Swihart at SUNY Buffalo had a really interesting process. Nobody really knew about it at the time. He was an assistant professor. His background was not in nanomaterials, totally under the radar, had like one paper in Langmuir or something like this, and was like, this looks interesting, sent it to, and then Paul and Dave, I think, went out to SUNY Buffalo to talk a couple times with Mark.
We went all over the place.
Yeah, and then, and then the plasma came from had a really interesting origin, and that this kind of, I'm a big believer in startups coming out of the university as a way to catalyze fundamental research. And so the plasma process originated going way back. Uwe Kortzagen in Minnesota really developed that out of his lab. And it started when Uwe was giving a seminar in mechanical engineering or something like that at UT. And I had met with him and I was talking to him, and at the time he was making like 70 nanometer silicon particles that would sort of settle on a device, and he was trying to make like a transistor out of them or something, and
solar cells.
Solar cell. So we had this discussion. I asked him, well, can you make particles less than 5 nanometers? And he was like, well, why would you do that? And so then this discussion ensued. And so, I don't know if I could take credit for pointing Uwe's research in a particular direction, but he certainly wasn't thinking about it at the time. And Novolite was there, had a real need for high yields of silicon nanocrystals in a certain size range, and then Uwe started working on that. And it worked, and then Novolite had a relationship there. So what ends up happening is you have the company, you have a core set of employees, and those employees have to be able to adapt. So they were all starting doing supercritical synthesis, like 500C and toluene at 100 bar pressure, and that's one system. And then Swihart's process was laser pyrolysis with a near-infrared laser of silane gas, entirely different. So some of the same people doing that. We also hired Mark's student to come in.
All postdocs. Employees.
And then in the case of the plasma synthesis, kind of the same thing. Sort of have the employees adapt. They learn how to do that. But you have to have a close relationship with the academic group in order to transfer the technology. And so, so you have to have a team of researchers in your company that are very strong scientists and are very adaptable. This is why it's really fun for people, technical people in startups, because you end up doing all kinds of stuff. Whereas if you go work for a large company, you're usually pigeonholed into one thing for a while. So it's like a really small, strong technical team that's very adaptable, and then having these external relationships. And the irony, I think, is that after a while, when Innovolite got large past a certain point, then they kind of cut off a lot of those relationships. And in the end, they relied on those because they had to have these relationships with these solar cell companies and that sort of thing. But definitely early on, like for me anyway, you're more effective as a small company having strong relationships with strong academic groups. And a lot of times these academic groups nobody knows about. Like, they're not the most famous people in the world.
What did you use the first 10,000 K for, and how many times did you invest, and how much more money? How many?
Oh yeah, that was actually yeah, we ended up putting.
Because you said there was a 10K loan.
10K. Yeah, I used 1,700 of it to go see Lou Bruce in Columbia. You know, like it was basically for due diligence. And so, yeah, a big chunk, because Lou Bruce's opinion really mattered, because he, did the first fundamental work on silicon nanoparticles, and so getting his endorsement was like a go no go decision, really. He, as well as the first experimental data. So I actually think one of the huge takeaways that you've heard the common thread of is being open and inclusive and making sure that you're collaborating and involving the right people. And that we were very open about, we had a big scientific advisory board of Jillian Buryak and others, so a huge group of, some were much less known than others, but they really understood the science that could help us with the technical challenges. And those are the folks that helped us get through this rocky road. It wasn't the board, really. The board was more information takers. It was the stuff we got out of the scientists that was so important. So yeah, we've done a few companies now in just 10 grand.
And how much did Arch then in the following rounds invest?
Innovolite took 62 million total. Yeah.
But not Arch alone.
No. We always bring in other venture groups. Yeah. And grants. I mean, we got big grants. I mean, Innovolite was really started on grants, like the 10 grand, and then the NSF grant, then DOE, and then we raised venture money. Over the last decade, Arch has brought in $1 billion in non-dilutive, grant funding for its companies. Really important. I mean, writing a good grant is also a good, solid attribute to have in one of these things, right? I mean, Brian's an excellent grant writer. I think, initially we had incredible luck.
Yeah, I mean, it validates the technology also to some extent, because if you have a group of peers reviewing your technology and they don't have anything at stake, and if they say, okay, this makes sense to give them a $150,000 grant to try it, then that, I think, is some validation. The other bit of that 10K we used for some supplies to make the first light-emitting diode was silicon. So we actually, because of this, with that small amount of money, made the first silicon nanocrystal light-emitting diode. I mean, there was poor silicon LED stuff, but this was like what we did back then.
How long did it take from the initial meeting of you two before you kind of knew it's going to be a success, however you define it? And kind of related question, like, did you have these time points where you thought, I'm going to have to give it up, like, seriously?
I'm still waiting to know if it's a success, knowing Paul.
Yeah. I mean, it really depends. That was a monthly thing. There was it was up and down all the time. But I actually think we always thought there was a huge potential there, because we actually had really solid core intellectual property, bunch of licenses. Again, we had a very outward-looking profile, and I think we always thought that it was just a question of doing what. And so it was frustrating to go to hit walls on the process and to hit walls on the applications. We used the particles also to do breast cancer imaging, and we did sensors, and we did a lot more than we're talking about. That's where you use your academic partners also. that research can continue in the lab at the university while the company focuses on one thing. And so we have a very active interplay back to the university when we do these things.
So there are like a lot of stages in all of these things too. I mean, I think the thing I didn't realize very early on when I met Paul is like, I mean, a Novolite from inception to exit was 10 years. And at the time we were thinking 3, you know, and it's just like it's definitely not a sprint. It's more like a marathon. And so I mean, I think that the good thing is probably after maybe a couple of conversations with Paul, I realized I trusted him, and you know, that hasn't changed. I haven't been burned for sure. Hopefully Paul hasn't been burned either. Yeah, but you know, you end up with all kinds of challenges with a Novolite and Pinion. Those were entirely different models for companies. I don't think we could have done a company like Pinion without first having gone through the experience of a Novolite, which also I think hardened our friendship in ways that you know, you just don't happen unless you go through like some really heavy experiences.
So I guess most people here in the audience are probably PhD students or postdocs at our institution. For those who are interested in pursuing a similar route, what would you recommend to people at that stage?
Well, I would say, I mean, there are actually a lot of opportunities with startup companies. I mean, I think founding a startup is one aspect to sort of being in the process, and then there's the other aspect, which is working at startups. Definitely, if you have a PhD, I'm not so sure about Europe, but for sure in the US, there are more and more opportunities with startup companies. So I have at least 2 of my former PhD students who work at startups right now. I have one former one who's started a company recently, and one of my current PhD students is also started. So actually one of my former PhD students and my current PhD student started a company. I have no idea if it'll be successful or not, but they're having a lot of fun. They're writing their first SBIR grant. So they haven't quit their day jobs. I mean, my former PhD student, his full-time job is at Samsung doing TEM all day, and he's just like, it just pays the bills. And but he's really excited about this company. And my current PhD student, he's currently a PhD student doing research with me, but they're trying to create this company on photovoltaics, and so that's fun. I mean, that's kind of the way a lot of startups get started. I think you leverage your resources. I think a lot of people don't necessarily quit their day job right at the beginning until they know they're going to get paid from the start, right? Isn't that?
Yeah, and if your day job is doing research in a novel area, I mean, you can't have a better situation to start a company. Like, especially if you don't have a lot of obligations, whatever, and you're in the lab doing interesting stuff. It's a perfect catalyst to get a company started.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I think the key aspect is being technically really good. If you want to jump to the dark side and go more on the business side, I would say have to have an MBA.
Isn't it the bright side?
Yeah.
Say so?
Bright side, that's right.
There's a careful delineation of tasks.
That's exactly why I invited you.
That's why he's on that side and I'm over here.
Are there any more questions or urgent questions? Let's have maybe 1 or 2, and then I suggest we move over to the even less formal bit of this event.
So when all this was going on, you also had the job at the university. How much time did that come into that, and how annoyed was the university about that?
The university wasn't annoyed. So time commitment, definitely. You know, I don't even. It's all a black hole. I don't even know how much time.
You know, can I take a stab at that? It's like we were just talking about this. I think it's really important. Like, at the early stages, what's scientifically interesting is exactly aligned with what's interesting commercially. like they diverge eventually when you get into like product development, you choose a product path. But you know, at the initial stages, trying to see if you could inject an electron in a hole into a silicon nanoparticle and get a photon out was extremely scientifically interesting, and it was very commercially relevant. And so it did probably involve a lot of time, but it wasn't something that you would segregate.
No.
I mean, Novolite's location was in the University of Texas for 2 years. Like, our employees were all visiting scientists in Brian's group, which is a very cost-effective way to do it.
Yeah, they were in my lab.
UT was totally supportive.
Yeah, so you end up with, you know, these employees of the company sign a visiting scientist agreement with the university. So the disadvantage to the company with having them in the lab is that anything they discover belongs to the university in terms of patent assignee rights and all that sort of thing. I would also have a committee, like an oversight committee, looking at what I was doing. So the real rules were, like, I couldn't have one of my PhD students employed in the company. So there had to be a firewall between my PhD students and the company, which I have a better idea of how to balance now after going through it a couple of times. But at that time when Novolite got started, that was like a real concern for me, trying to make sure I'm doing everything okay. In terms of time, so the company's goals were really aligned with my scientific goals. So the thing that ended up, like, time-wise was, it was basically like increasing my group by 1/3, which meant workload by 1/3. Okay, so I had a group of 15 PhD students at the time, and we hired like 7 Novolite employees over the course of a 1.5 years or so. And so then you have all these more people to manage, and then thinking about the company, there are different things, because your goal is not publishing a paper in the company. Your goal is to develop the technology to make money. So I think what's exciting is all those things are pretty well aligned, but it means that you are working more. And so that was really, really fun and exciting. But my current PhD student, or at that time, my PhD students were like, oh, I remember when Novolite was founded, and then we saw you a lot less. Which they didn't really see me a lot. I mean, I was there, it's just I had more people I was managing and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what happens.
Maybe in the back, and then we're connecting.
So what would be, for a starting company, very interesting to have in a campus like isolation? Like, are there facilities that would be interesting to be sharing, or do you need some kind of specific infrastructure, or is it just as long as you have a connection to what is happening in the building, it's okay?
What kind of facilities at IST? Is that what you're asking?
In general, for a campus, like, why would you, for instance, start your company, like, how is it closer to a campus of a university?
Okay, so in the case of Novolite, we had it there because we had very little money. So you're always trying to conserve money. If you go off campus, you have to rent a lab, for one thing. Then the other thing is, if you think about a lot of the tools, especially for nanoscience, like a TEM, an SEM. I mean, if you're a startup company and you decide, oh, I want my own TEM, my own SEM, my own X-ray diffractometer, which there are startup companies who think like that, and they quickly have to raise a lot more money. Hopefully everyone's learned their lesson, but some of the earlier ones would just burn through like $20 million of cash on infrastructure instead of just leveraging their resources, like work with the university for another year or two to make sure that there really is something viable in the technology. And then once you get to that point, then you definitely want to be off campus. You spend the money to rent the facilities. If you're very successful, then yeah, you might buy your own TEM, that sort of thing. But even then, you're probably still leveraging the university for those more specialized, very expensive tools.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the collaboration with the university. I think, you know, leveraging, it's not just the lab and the equipment, it's the air handling, it's the whole works. I think the key takeaway is you want to spend every euro in a way that adds direct value to the science, advancing the science. And buying equipment, you know, it's more indirect. Like if you can put that into labor and materials to actually advance the technology, that gives you more bang for your euro. Sorry.
You said you were looking cross borders. You were also looking at Europe, for instance.
Yeah.
What does it need on top of a technology that might have a couple of applications for the people here in this room in order to get attractive to Arch?
The core intellectual property with the multiple applications, that is it. And so I reside in Dublin.
Else.
No, that really is how we start all of our companies. That is a key attribute where, and a bunch of those applications, need to attend areas that are exciting. So the fundamental stuff is really important. It's really important because the Me Too sort of, if you're working on the next CAD Telluride solar cell and trying to increase the efficiency by 5%, that's not going to be a company will be able to do. It's focused in one particular vertical, improving one particular area. Someone else can do that deal, but if it's a new type of material that can attend to 10 different applications, that's something we'd want to do. And we do look hard at it. You're right, I reside in Dublin, and so I, every week, am trekking around. I didn't have time to do it today, but there's someone at the University of Vienna that's doing really interesting work on a terahertz detector. It's done at 20 Kelvin, so it's, there's still a little bit theoretical, but that's, it's sort of the same thing, right? I saw it come on the wire, pulled the paper, interesting work, and if I didn't run into time trouble today, I would have stopped in there. So that's how these things start. Like terahertz is one of those areas that there's multiple different, very interesting applications. The last piece of electromagnetic spectrum that no one's really been able to harness in a cost-effective and a compact way. It's an anecdote. I'm just having this as an anecdote. So.
Yeah, I would throw in the other thing that helps is having like some openness, like the investigators being open to talking to explaining their stuff. Yeah, so having an openness for a discussion and also a frank discussion. Like I think sometimes academics are afraid to say what the weaknesses are of what they do. They're like, oh yeah, I've got this graphene technology, it's going to revolutionize the world, give me a bunch of money, start a company.
Example.
Yeah, and someone like Paul's going to be like, well, there's a bunch of people doing graphene, and so it's not, so being able to explain not only the potential of what you have, but also its limitations. So I think, I've been with Paul talking to different people, and you have people who will say, Paul will ask, well, who else is doing this? Like, who are your competitors? And so many people will say, oh, no one. It's like, no, we're the only one. We got a paper in Nature. We're the only one who's doing this. And that's not a good answer. That just makes you look kind of foolish and someone that you probably wouldn't trust to work with to start a company. Because there probably are certain elements and aspects that are yours and you should state what those are, but there's always somebody in your space in some way. Understanding what the intellectual property barriers might be can be helpful in some ways. So when someone says, oh, I have this really amazing patent, I have the space, it's all mine, like that's also never true.
So to Paul, how did you end up at the dark side? So what is your background? How got you interested in the research and stuff like this? Maybe you can help us out a little bit.
Yeah, no, I had an operations background. I ended up going back to business school, and I got this fellowship with the Kauffman Center for Entrepreneurship, and they put me in venture capital. I was not targeting venture capital at all. I wanted to do a company, and so when I first started Arch, I wasn't an Arch employee. I was placed there on this fellowship, and that's when we started Innovolite. And then when we were done with Innovolite, I just rolled on to Arch, and since then I've done 5 other companies, and one of which was with Brian Pinion. A couple didn't work out. It's an interesting thing. You put in a little bit of money. There's 2 where I put in the 10 grand. It's like, it's not going to work. And you just have to have the discipline to turn it off if it's not. Yeah, and then I just stayed and I really enjoy it, I guess.
Well, I'm getting signs that we should be moving over to the other part. Well, thanks very much.